Hello everyone. Today's lesson is Mother's Day. So, Mother's Day, written by JB Priestley. The following play is a humorous portrayal of the statue of the mother in a family. Let us read on to see how Mrs. Pearson's family react when she tries to stand up for her own right. So, this is basically about a mother in a family, and it tells us about Mrs. Pearson's family. So the characters given here are Mrs. Annie Pearson, George Pearson, Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, and Mrs. Fitzgerald. So these are the characters mentioned in the lesson. So let's continue. The action takes place in the living room of the Pearson's house in a London suburb. So the time, it is a present scene. The living room of the Pearson's family. Afternoon, it is a comfortably furnished, much lived in room in a small suburban semi detached villa. If necessary, only one door needed to be used, but it is better with two, one up left leading to the front door and the stairs, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. There can be a muslin covered window in the left wall and possibly one in the right wall too. The fireplace is assumed to be in the fourth wall. There is a settee up right, an armchair down left, and one down right. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stand at the center. So first they're told about the characters and then about the time and the scene. The scene is just a description of the place where they're sitting. So it is a living room of the Pearson's family, and the time is afternoon. The time of the day, it is afternoon, and it is very comfortably furnished and much lived in room in a small suburban semi detached villa. And if necessary, they're talking about the doors to be used. They're telling only necessarily one door is needed to be used, but it's better with two, one up left leading to the front door and the stairs, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. There can be a muslin covered window in the left wall and possibly one in the right wall too. The fireplace is assumed to be the fourth wall. So there is a settee upright, an armchair down left, and one down right. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stand at the center. Let us continue. When the curtain rises, it is an afternoon in the early autumn, and the stage can be well lit. Mrs. Person at right and Mrs. Fitzgerald at left are sitting opposite each other at the small table, on which were on which are two teacups and saucers and the cards with which Mrs. Fitzgerald has been telling Miss Person's fortune. Mrs. Person is a pleasant but worried looking woman in her 40s. Mrs. Fitzgerald is older, heavier, and a strong woman in her 40s. Mrs. Fitzgerald is older, older, heavier, and a stronger and sinister personality. She's smoking is very important that these two should have sharply contrasting voices. Mrs. Person speaking in a light, flurried, soft of tune, with a touch of suburbance, Cockney perhaps, and Mrs. Fitzgerald with a deep voice, rather Irish perhaps. So this is a play. It's play like story, and now the scene is over, and then they're talking about the play is about to start. So the curtain will rise, and it is afternoon, early autumn, and the stage can be well lit. So as you can see in the photo, there are two ladies sitting on the table, and they are Mrs. Person and Mrs. Fitzgerald. So Mrs. Person is in the right and Mrs. Fitzgerald at the left. They are sitting opposite to each other at the small table, in which there are two teacups and saucers. So, and the cards which Mrs. Fitzgerald has been telling Mrs. Person's fortune. Mrs. Fitzgerald has been telling Miss Person's fortune. So now the description of these two ladies are given. The appearance and the way they speak. So Mrs. Person, which is at the right, she is described as a pleasant but worried looking woman in her 40s. So Mrs. Person sitting at the right is described as a pleasant but worried looking woman in her 40s. But on the other hand, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is sitting at the left, is older, heavier, and strong and sinister personality. So they are comparing the two women, whereas this Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant woman. On the other hand, Mrs. Fitzgerald is older and strong and heavier, and she's having a sinister personality, an evil personality. So she's smoking, and it is very important that these two should have sharply contrasting voices. So Mrs. Person speaking in a light, flurried, soft tune, and with a touch of suburban cockney perhaps, and Mrs. Fitzgerald with deep voice rather than Irish. So as we move on, now the play starts. Mrs. Fitzgerald collecting up the cards. And that's all I can tell you, Mrs. Person. Could be a good fortune, could be a bad one. All depends on yourself now. Make up your mind, and there it is. Mrs. Person. Yes, thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I am much obliged. I am sure it is wonderful having a great real fortune teller living next door. Did you learn that out east too? So here Mrs. Fitzgerald is told as the fortune teller. So she tells the fortune of the people. You could also say predicting the future. So she's collecting her cards, and she's telling Mrs. Person that it could be a good fortune or it could be a bad one, but it all depends on yourself now. So make up your mind, and there it is. So Mrs. Person replies by thanking her, and she says she's much obliged, and she's sure, and it is wonderful to have a real fortune teller living next door. Did you learn that out east too? She asks her, she thanks Mrs. Fitzgerald and for having like a wonderful fortune teller living next door. So she asks her whether she had learned that out in the east too. Mrs. Fitzgerald. I did. 12 years I had of it, with my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster. He learned a lot, and I learned a lot more. But will you make up your mind now, Mrs. Person dear? Put your food down once and for all, and be the mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family. She, she tells she tells Mrs. Person that she learned 12 years, and along with her old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster, and he learned a lot and she also learned. So she asked her to make up her mind, Mrs. Person dear, and ask her to put her food down, and once and for all, and be the mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family. Mrs. Person, smiling apologetically. That's easier said than done. Besides, I'm so fond of them, even if they are so thoughtless and selfish. They don't mean to be. So when Miss Fitzgerald asked her if she want to be the mistress of a family, Mrs. Person smiles apologetically and replies that it is easy to say than being done. So she likes them very much, and even though they are thoughtless and selfish, as they are not trying to be very thoughtless and selfish. Mrs. Fitzgerald, cutting in. Maybe not, but it would be better for them if they learned to treat you properly. Mrs. Person, yes, I suppose it would, in a way. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, maybe not. She interrupts and say, maybe not. And it would be better if they treat Mrs. Person better and properly. So even Mrs. Person agrees, saying, yes, I suppose it would be in a way. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald replies, no doubt about it all. Who's the better for being spoiled grown man, lad or girl? Nobody, you think it does am good when you run after them all the time. Take their orders as if you were the servant in the house. Stay at home every night while they go out enjoying themselves. Never in all your life. It's the ruin of them as well as you. Husbands, sons, daughters should be taking notice of wives and mothers, not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. And don't tell me you don't know what I mean, for I know more than you've told me. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, she asks who's better being spoiled, grown man, lad, or girl. And nobody thinks it's good when you run after them all the time, taking the orders as if they are servant of the house, while the mother stay at home every night and work for the family. The children, husband, etc. all go out enjoying themselves. So never in all your life. It is a ruin of them as well as you. Husbands, sons, daughters should be taking notice of wives. They should also give equal importance to wives and mothers, and not giving them orders and treating them like dirt and servants. And she also says, and don't tell me you don't know what I mean, for I know more than what you have told me. Mrs. Person replies, doubtiously, I keep dropping a hint. Dubiously, I keep dropping a hint. Mrs. Fitzgerald, hint? It's more than hints your family needs. Mrs. Person. Mrs. Pearson, dubiously, I suppose it is, but do I hate any unpleasantness? And it is so hard to know where to start. I keep making up my mind to have it out with them, but somehow I don't know how to begin. She glances at a watch or at a clock. Oh, good gracious, look at the time. Nothing ready. They'll be home in any minute and probably all in a hurry to go out again. So, Mrs. Person says that she keep dropping them a hint that even she wants equal treatment and she doesn't want them to treat her like dirt, even she wants to go out, etc. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald even asks hint. It's more than hints that your family needs, Mrs. Person. So, Mrs. Person dubiously replies, I suppose it is, but she doesn't hate any unpleasantness. So it is hard to know where to start. So she keeps making up her mind that she have to say them anyhow, but she don't know where to begin. And then she glances at her watch at the clock. Oh, good gracious! Look at the time. So she suddenly looks at her watch or a clock and she exclaims, good gracious! Look at the time. So nothing ready. Nothing is ready at home. They'll be at home any in a minute and probably they'll be hurried to go out. As she's about to rise. As she's about to rise, Mrs. Fitzgerald reaches out across the table and pulls her down. So she's about to get up and go to her home, but Mrs. Fitzgerald reaches out her across the table and pulls her down, and she pulls her back to the chair. Mrs. Fitzgerald, let them wait or look after themselves for once. This is where your food goes down. Start now. She lights a cigarette from one that she has just finished. So she's telling, let them wait for once. This is where your food goes down. Start now. And she began smoking. Mrs. Person, embarrassed. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I know you mean well. In fact, I agree with you, but I just can't. It is no use you trying to make me. If I promise you, I would really have it out with them. I know I wouldn't be able to keep my promise. Mrs. Fitzgerald, then let me do it. Mrs. Person, flustered. Oh no, thank you very much, Mrs. Fitzgerald, but that wouldn't do at all. It couldn't possibly be somebody else. They'd resent it at once and would listen, and really, I wouldn't blame them. I know I ought to do it, but you see how it is? She looks apologetically across the table, smiling rather miserably. Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, you haven't got the idea. Mrs. Person, bewildered. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you asked me to let you do it. So, Mrs. Person says, I know you agreed and I know what you mean, and she also agrees, but it is no use of trying to make me. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald says, then let me do it. So, Mrs. Person says, no, thank you, and it wouldn't do that and all those things, and they won't listen and wouldn't listen, and really, I wouldn't blame them. Mrs. Fitzgerald says, you didn't get the idea. She's trying to tell her something else. Mrs. Person, I'm sorry, I thought you asked me to let it do it. Mrs. Fitzgerald says, I did, but not as me, as you. Mrs. Person, but I don't understand. You couldn't be me. Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, we change places, or really? Bodies. You look like me, I look like you. But that's impossible, Mrs. Person says. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to say, why can't we switch spaces? I mean, why can't we switch our places? Like the bodies. Like, you look like me, I look like you, but that's impossible, Mrs. Person says. Mrs. Fitzgerald, how do you know? Have you ever tried it? Mrs. Person, of course not. Mrs. Fitzgerald. I have. Not for some time, but it still ought to work. Won't last long, but long enough for what we want to do. Learn it out east, of course, where they where they're all up to these tricks. She holds her hands across the table, keeping the cigarette in her mouth. Give me your hands, dear. Mrs. Person, dubiously. Well, I don't know. Is it right? So she wanted her to teach her family that she also needs equal importance. So Mrs. Fitzgerald asked her to change their bodies so she can be in place of Mrs. Person's body, and she can teach them a lesson. So Mrs. Fitzgerald asks, how you know? Ever tried it? So Person says no, of course not. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, not for some time, but ought to work. Won't last for long, but enough that we want to do. It won't last for long, but we can stay in the each other's body for long enough for what we want to do. Learn it out east, of course, where they taught up all these tricks. And she holds out her hand on the table, keeping the cigarette in her mouth. Give me your hands, dear. Mrs. Person, dubiously. Well, I don't know. Is it right? Mrs. Fitzgerald, it's your only chance. Give me your hand and keep quiet. Mrs. Fitzgerald, it's your only chance. Give me your hand and keep quiet a minute. Just don't think about anything. Taking her hands, now look at me. And they stare at each other, muttering, Arshata dum, lam, Arshata lam dumbona. So they chant something, and this little scene should be acted very carefully. We are to assume that the personalities change the body. After the spell has been spoken, both women, still grasping hands, go lax as if the lives were out of them. Both come to life, but with the personality of the other. Each must try to adopt the voice and mannerism of the other. So now Mrs. Person is bold and dominating, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is nervous and fluttering. So they cast a spell. Mrs. Fitzgerald casts a spell, and this scene should be acted. And before that, they chant a little before exchanging the personalities of the body. They chant, and this scene should be acted very carefully. So we have to assume that personalities changes the body. So Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality will move on to Mrs. Person's body, and Mrs. Person's personality move on to Mrs. Fitzgerald's body. So now Mrs. Person is strong and dominating, whereas Mrs. Fitzgerald is given as nervous and fluttering. Mrs. Person, now with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality. See what I mean, dear? She notices a cigarette. Here, you don't want that. She snatches it and put it in her own mouth, puffing contentedly. So now Mrs. Person is Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality. She is having Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality. See what I mean, dear? She notices a cigarette, and here you go, you don't want that. She snatches it and put it in her own mouth. Mrs. Fitzgerald, now with Mrs. Person's personality, looks down at herself and see that her body changed and gives a scream of fright. So Mrs. Fitzgerald has a body with Mrs. Person's personality. So Mrs. Person, she looks down at herself and sees her body, and it is changed. So she gives a scream of fright. Mrs. Fitzgerald with Mrs. Person's personality. Oh, it's happened. So Mrs. Fitzgerald got Mrs. Person's personality and she says, oh, it's happened. It changed. Our personalities are in each other's body. Mrs. Person co- complacently. Of course, it's happened. Very neat, but didn't know I had it in me. Mrs. Fitzgerald, alarmed. But whatever shall I do, Mrs. Fitzgerald? George and the children can't see me like this. Mrs. Person, grimly. They aren't going to, that's the point. They'll have me to deal with. Only they won't know it. Mrs. Fitzgerald, still alarmed. But what if we can't change back? It would be terrible. Mrs. Person, here, steady, Mrs. Person. If you had to live my life, it wouldn't be so bad. You would have more fun as me and you've had as you. Than you've had as you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but I don't want to be anybody else. Mrs. Person, now stop worrying. It's easier changing back. I can do it anytime we want. Mrs. Fitzgerald will do it now. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald actually, with Mrs. Person's personality, says, "What shall she do?" And she's saying, talking about George and the children. They can't see her like this. So Mrs. Person, with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality, says, "That's the point. They aren't going to see. They have to deal with me, so they won't know." So Mrs. Fitzgerald, still alarmed, asks, "If what if we can't change back? It will be terrible." So Mrs. Person replies by saying to Mrs. Fitzgerald, "If you, Mrs. Person, if you had to live my life, it wouldn't be so bad, and she'll have more fun than she had before." So Mrs. Fitzgerald, with Mrs. Person's personality, says she don't want to be anyone else. Mrs. Person, now stop worrying. It is easier changing back. Then I do it anytime we want. Mrs. Fitzgerald will do it now. Not likely, Mrs. Person. Not likely. I've got to deal with your family first. That's the first idea, isn't it? Didn't know how to begin with them. You said, well, I'll show you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, but what am I going to do, Mrs. Person? Going to my house for a bit. There's nobody there. Then pop back and see how we are doing. You ought to enjoy it. Better get off now before one of them comes. Mrs. Fitzgerald, nervously rising. Yes, I suppose that's the best. You sure it'll be all right? Mrs. Person, chuckling. It will be wonderful. Now off you go, dear. So, Mrs. Person says, not likely. I have to deal with your family first. That's the idea, isn't it? So, didn't know how to begin with. Well, I'll show you. Mrs. Fitzgerald. So she'll ask, what is she supposed to do? Mrs. Person says, go into her house for a bit and there's nobody there. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald, nervously rising, she says, I suppose that's the best. You sure it'll be all right? Mrs. Person, chuckling, it will be wonderful. Now off you go, dear. Mrs. Fitzgerald crosses and hurries out through the door right. Left to herself, Mrs. Person smokes away, lighting another cigarette, and begins laying out the cards for patients on the table. After a few moments, Doris Person comes bursting in left. She's a pretty girl in her early 20s who would be pleasant enough if she had not been spoiled. So, Mrs. Person goes out, whereas Mrs. Fitzgerald sits across. Mrs. Person, who is now in the Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, Mrs. Fitzgerald, so goes out through the door and left to herself, and she smokes while Mrs. Person smokes away, lighting another cigarette, and begin laying out the cards for patients on the table. And after a few moments, Doris Person comes bursting in left. Doris Person means She's a girl in her early 20s and would be pleasant enough if she had not been spoiled. So here, Doris is Mrs. Person's daughter. She's a pretty girl in her early 20s, but she's a spoiled child. Doris, before she has taken anything in, Mum, you'll have to iron my yellow silk. I must wear it tonight. She now sees what is happening and is astounded. What are you doing? She moves down and left center. Mrs. Person uses her ordinary voice, but her manner is not fluttering and apologetic, but cool and incisive. Mrs. Person, not even looking up. What do you think I'm doing? Whitewashing the ceiling? Doris, still astounded. But you're smoking. Mrs. Person, that's right, dear. No law against it, is there? Doris, Mrs. Person, that's right, dear. No law against it, is there? Doris, I thought you didn't smoke. Mrs. Person, then you thought wrong. Doris, are we having tea in the kitchen? Mrs. Person, have it where you like, dear. Doris, angrily, do you mean it isn't ready? Mrs. Person, yours isn't. I've had that all I want. Might go out later and get a square meal at the Clarendon. Doris, hardly believing her ears. Who might? So, this is a conversation now taking place between Doris, Mrs. Person's daughter, and Mrs. Person. So, she's described as a spoiled, pretty girl who is in her early 20s. So, without even looking up, Mrs. Person, when Mrs. Person says, when Doris asks her that she has to, Doris orders her mother to iron her yellow silk and she had to wear it tonight. So Doris also sees that Mrs. Person is sitting down and then smoking, which she never does. So Mrs. Person is now using her ordinary voice, but her manner is not fluttering and apologetic. Now she's cool and insensitive. And Mrs. Person, without even looking up, she says, what do you think I'm doing? Whitewashing the ceiling. Doris, still astounded. But you're smoking. Mrs. Person, that's right, dear. No law against it, is there? So Doris says to her mother that you're smoking. Her mother never smokes and they haven't seen her smoke. So Mrs. Person says, that's right. There's no law against it. It's there. So Doris says, I thought you didn't smoke. And Mrs. Person replies, then you are wrong. So Doris again asks whether they're having tea in the kitchen. But Mrs. Person says, you can have it where you like, dear. And Doris angrily asks, do you mean that it isn't ready? The tea is not ready, she asks. Mrs. Person, yours isn't. She says, I haven't prepared tea for you, my dear daughter, but she has prepared for herself and she had the tea. And she's saying she might go out in the evening or later the square meal at Clarendon. Doris hardly believing her ears. Who might? Mrs. Pearson, I might. Who do you think? Doris, staring at her mum, what's the matter with you? Mrs. Person, don't be silly. Doris, indignantly, it's not me that's being silly, and I must say it's a bit much when I've been working hard all day and you can't even bother to get my tea ready. Did you hear what I said about my yellow silk? Mrs. Person, no. Don't you like it now? I never did. Doris, indignantly, of course I like it, and I am going to wear it tonight, so I want it ironed. Mrs. Person, want it ironed? What do you think it's going to do? Iron itself? Doris, no, you're going to iron it for me. You always do. Mrs. Person, well, this time I don't. And don't talk rubbish to me about working hard. I've had good idea how much work you do. Doris Person, I put in twice the hours you do and get no wages. No thanks for it. What are you going to wear? Your yellow silk. Why are you going to wear your yellow silk? Where are you going? Doris sulkily. Doris. Out with Charlie Spence. Mrs. Person. Why? Doris. Quietly. Why? What's the matter with you? Why wouldn't I go out Charlie Spence? If you ask me, I want to. Any objection? Go on. You might as well as tell me. Mrs. Person. Severely. Can't you find anybody better? I wouldn't be seen dead with Charlie Spence. Buck teeth and half-witted. But Doris, he isn't, Mrs. Person. When I was your age, I would have found somebody better than Charlie Spence or given myself up as a bad job. Doris, nearly in tears. Oh, shut up. Doris runs out left and Mrs. Pearson chuckles and begins putting her cards together. After a moment, Cyril Person enters. He is a masculine counterpart of Doris. So, in this conversation between her daughter and Mrs. Person, Mrs. Person asks, she might go out, and who do you think? So Doris actually replies, staring at her, ask her, like, what's her problem with you? And Mrs. Person also says, don't be silly. And Doris says, it's not me being silly, I've been working so hard all day, and you won't even bother to make my tea ready. And did you hear what I said about my yellow silk? So Mrs. Person said, no, don't you like it now? I never did. So Doris says, of course she liked it and she's going to wear it tonight, so she want it ironed. Mrs. Person says, want it ironed? What do you think it's going to do? Iron itself. So Doris says, no, that you're going to iron it for me and you always do. Mrs. Person, well, this time I don't. This time she's not going to iron it. And she's telling not to speak a rubbish about her working hard. She have a good idea how much work she do. And she put in twice the hours you do. So she get no wages for it. She works twice harder than Doris and she have no wages for it, nor a thanks. Why are you wearing that yellow silk? Where are you going? So Doris actually says she is going out with Charlie Spence. And Mrs. Person says, why? So Doris again asks, why? What's the matter with you? Shouldn't I go out with Charlie Spence? And if you ask her out, she will go. Any objection? Go on. You might as well as want to tell me. Mrs. Person says, can't you find anybody better? And she wouldn't want to be seen dead with Charlie Spence, buck teeth and half-witted. So Doris says he isn't. And Mrs. Person says when she was her age, she would have found someone better, not someone like Charlie Spence. So Doris is almost in tears and she says, shut up. And Doris runs out left. And Mrs. Person chuckles and begins putting the cards together. After a moment, Cyril Person enters. Cyril Person is a masculine counterpart of Doris. So Cyril is shown as Mrs. Person's son. Briskly, Cyril enters the room and he asks his mother, tea ready. Mrs. Person, no. Cyril, moving on to the table annoyed. Why not? Mrs. Person coolly. I wouldn't bother. Cyril, feeling off color or something? Mrs. Person, never felt better in my life. Cyril, aggressively. What's the idea then? Mrs. Person, just a change. Cyril, briskly. Well, snap out of it, ma, and get crackling. Haven't too much time. Cyril's about to go when Mrs. Person's voice checks him. Mrs. Person, I've had plenty of time. Cyril, but I haven't. Got a busy night tonight, moving left to the door. Did you put my things out? Mrs. Person, coolly. Can't remember, but I doubt it. Cyril, moving to the table protesting. Now look. When I asked you this morning, you promised and you said you would have to look through them first in case there was any mending. Mrs. Person, yes, well now I've decided I don't like mending. Cyril, that's a nice way to talk. What would happen if you talked like that, Mrs. Person? You all do talk like that. If there's something at home you don't want to do, you don't do it. If there's something at your work, you get the union to bar it. Now all that's happened is that I've joined the movement. Cyril staggered. I don't get this, Mom. What's going on? Mrs. Person, laconic and sinister. Changes. Doris enters left. She's in the process of dressing and now wearing a wrap. She looks pale. She is in the process of dressing and now wearing a wrap. She looks pale and red-eyed. Mrs. Person, you look terrible. I wouldn't wear that even for Charles Spence. Doris, moving about the table angrily. Oh, shut up about Charlie Spence. Anyhow, I'm not ready yet. Just dressing. And if I do look, so here the conversation is between Cyril, the mother, and the person. So even she opposes when he asks the tea is ready, and Cyril gets angrily and asks why not, and she replies that she wouldn't bother, and then he again asks her whether she's feeling off color or something, and Mrs. Person replies she has never felt better in her life. Now, what's the idea? Then she asks. Mrs. Person says just a change. Cyril, well, snap out of it, ma, and get crackling. Haven't got too much time. So, Cyril is about to go when Mrs. Person's voice checks him. Cyril orders his mother to snap out of it and get crackling. He hasn't got much time. So, Mrs. Person says she's got plenty of time. And Cyril says yes, but he don't have much time. And he's got a busy night and he moves to the left door. Did you put my things out? Cyril asks her whether she had put his things out, and Mrs. Person says she can't remember. So Cyril moved to the table protesting, and he says, now look, when I asked you this morning, you promised and you said you'd have to look through them first in case there was any mending. And his person replies, yes, but now she've decided that she don't like mending. Cyril, that's a nice way to talk, but what would happen if we all talk like this, Mrs. Person? You all do talk like that. If there's something at home you don't want to do, you don't do it. If there's something at your work, you get the union to the bar to bar it. Now that's all happened is that I've joined the movement. Cyril, I don't get this, Mom. What's going on, Mrs. Person? Changes. So Doris enters left and she's in the process of dressing and now wearing a wrap and she looks pale and red-eyed. So Mrs. Person says, you look terrible and I wouldn't wear that face even for Charlie Spence. Doris, moving to the table angrily. Oh, shut up about Charlie Spence. And anyhow, I'm not ready yet. I'm just dressing and if I do look terrible, it's your fault. You made me cry. Cyril curious. Why? What did she do? Doris, never you mind. Mrs. Person, rising and preparing to move to the kitchen. Have we any stout left? I can't remember. Bottle or two, I think. But you don't want a stout now, Mrs. Person. Moving left slowly. I do. Cyril, what for? Mrs. Person, turning at the door. To drink, you clot. Mrs. Person exits right instantly, and Cyril and Doris in a huddle, close together at left center, rapidly whispering. Doris, has she been like that with you too? Cyril, yes, no tea ready. Couldn't care less. Doris, well, I'm glad it's both of us. I thought I've done something wrong. Cyril, so did I, but it's her, of course. Doris, she was smoking and playing cards when I came in. I couldn't believe my eyes. Cyril, I asked her if she was feeling color off or something and she said she wasn't. Doris, well, she's suddenly all different and that's what made me cry. It wasn't what she said, but the way she said it, in the way she looked. Cyril, haven't noticed that. She looks just the same to me. Doris, she doesn't to me. Do you think she could have hit her head or something? You know, and God, what's it, you know? Cyril, staggered. Do you mean she's barred me? No, you father. Feathered. You know, concussion. She might have. Cyril, sounds far-fetched. Doris, well, she's far-fetched if you ask me. He suddenly begins to giggle. Now then, what's it? Doris, if she's going to be like this when Dad comes home, she giggles again, beginning to guffaw. I'm staying in for. So she says it's terrible. and it's your fault to Mrs. Person that she made her cry. So Doris says, so even Cyril asks, what did she do? So she says, never mind. And she moves to the kitchen to ask for stout. And Cyril asks, why do you need it? So Mrs. Person says she need. So Cyril asks what for, and Mrs. Person says to drink, you clot. And then Mrs. Person exits the right, and instantly Cyril and Doris started talking close together and whispering. And Doris asks, has been she been like this with you too? And Cyril says, yeah, she has been with me like this only. So Doris says, I thought she had done something. I mean, I thought I had something, but well, I'm glad it's both of us. So Cyril says, so did I, but it's her, of course. And Doris says she was playing cards, smoking and playing cards when she came in. So she couldn't believe her eyes. And Cyril asked her if she was feeling well, and she said she wasn't. Doris says suddenly she's all different, and that's what made her cry. Not what she said, but the way she said it, it made her cry. So Cyril says he hasn't noticed it. She looked the same to me. So Doris said, no, she hasn't. Do you think she have hit her head or somewhere? What's it? Concussion. She says whether she has hit her head and that's why she's behaving like this. But Cyril says sound far-fetched. Well, she's far-fetched if you ask me, Doris replies. And then they ask what else. So Doris thinks, what if when she's going to behave like this when father comes? So she's like, so Cyril says, I'm staying. That two front dresses circles for the most house. So Mrs. Person enters right, carrying a bottle of stout and half-filled glass. Cyril and Doris try to stop their coughing and giggling, but they're not quick enough. Mrs. Person regards them with contempt. So she went to the kitchen to get her stout, and she's back with a glass. And then Cyril and Doris are still giggling and guffawing. So Mrs. Person coldly says, you two are always talking about being grown up. Why don't you both try once to be your age? She moves to CT and sits. Cyril, can't we laugh now? Mrs. Person, yes, if it's funny. Go on, tell me. Make me laugh. I could do with it. Doris, you never understand our jokes, Mum. So, Mrs. Person says, you're always talking about being grown up. So, why don't we act like one? So, then Cyril says, why can't we laugh now? So, Mrs. Person says, yeah, if it's funny, go on and tell her also. Make her laugh and she could also do it. So Doris says she never understands the joke. Mrs. Person, I was yawning at your jokes before you were born, Doris. Doris, almost tearful again. What's making you talk like that? What have we done? Mrs. Person promptly. Nothing but come in, ask for something, go out again, and then come back when there's nowhere else to go. Cyril aggressively, look, if you won't get tea ready, then I'll find something to eat myself. Mrs. Person, why not? Help yourself. She takes a sip of stout. Cyril, turning on his way to the kitchen. Mind you, I think it's a bit thick. I've been wondering all day. Doris, same here, Mrs. Person. Calmly, 8 hours a day. Cyril, yeah, 8 hours a day, and don't forget it. Mrs. Person, I've done 8 hours. My 8 hours. Cyril, that's different. Doris, of course it is, Mrs. Person. Mrs. Person, it was. Now it isn't. 40 hours week all now. Just watch it at the weekend when I have my 2 days off. Doris and Cyril exchange alarmed glances. They stare at Mrs. Person who returns their look calmly. Mrs. Person, I've done my 8 hours. Cyril, that's different. Doris, of course it is. Mrs. Person calmly. It was. Now it's different. 40 hours week for all now. Just watch it at the weekend when I have my 2 days off. So Doris and Cyril exchange alarm glances. They stare at Mrs. Person who returns their look calmly. Cyril must grab something to eat. Look as if I'll need to keep my strength up. Cyril exits to kitchen. Exit to kitchen. Doris, moving to the settle anxiously. Mommy, you don't mean you're not going to do anything on Saturday and Sunday? Mrs. Person. No, I wouldn't go that far. I might make a bed or too and do a bit of cooking as favor, which means of course I'll have to be asked very nicely and thankful. Doris, aghast, go off for the weekend? Mrs. Person, why not? I could do the I could do with a change. Stuck here day after day, week after week. If I don't need a change, who does? Doris, but where would you go? Who would you go with? Mrs. Person, that is my business. You don't ask me where you should go and with who you should go with, do you? Doris, that's different. Mrs. Person, that's only difference is that I am a lot older and I am better able to look after myself. So it's you who should do the asking. Doris, did you fall or hit yourself with something? Mrs. Person, coldly, no, but I'll hit you with something. Girl, if you don't stop asking silly questions. Doris stares at her open mouthed, ready to cry. Doris, oh, this is awful. She begins to cry, not passionately. Mrs. Person, coldly, stop blubbering. You're not a baby. If you're old enough to go out with Charlie Spence, you're old enough to behave properly. Now stop it. So, Doris asks, go for the weekend, and Mrs. Person replies, why not? I could do with a change, and she has been stuck in her home day after day and week after week, and she does. If she doesn't want to change, then who does? And then Doris again asks, where would you go? Who would you go out with? And then Mrs. Person says that's her business, and you don't ask her where you should go and who you should hang out with, do you? So Doris says that's different. And Person says the only difference is that she's older and better be able to look after herself. So it's them who should do the asking. Doris, did you fall or hit yourself with something? Asks. Mrs. Person says coldly no, but I'll hit you with something, girl, if you don't stop asking silly questions. Again, Doris is astonished and stares at her open mouthed, ready to cry. Doris and then begins to cry. Whereas Mrs. Person says, stop blubbering and you're not a baby. If you're old enough to go out with Charlie Spence, you're old enough to behave properly. Now stop it. George Person enters left. He's about 50, fundamentally decent but solemn. Self important, pompous, preferably he should be a heavy, slow moving type. He notices Doris' tears. So George enters the house and he is about 50 years old. And George says, hello, what's this? Can't be anything to cry about. Doris, through sobs. You'll see. Doris runs out, left with a sob or two on the way. George stares after her a moment, then looks at Mrs. Person. George, did she say you'll see? Mrs. Person, yes. What does she mean? Mrs. Person, better ask her. So George enters and then he asks, what is this and why is she crying, etc. Doris replies that you will see, and then Doris leaves the room through the door. And then George questions, did she say you will see? And Mrs. Person agrees and says yes. George again asks and inquires about what she meant by saying you will see. Mrs. Person says better ask her. And then George slowly looks again at the door and then at Mrs. Person. Then he notices the doubt that Mrs. Person raises for another step. His eyes almost bulge. And then George becomes confused and looks at the door and then at Mrs. Person. And then he notices the stout the Mrs. Person raises for another sip. The drink which Mrs. Person is having. His eyes almost bulge. He becomes so surprised. Stout? Mrs. Person, yes. George, amazed. What are you drinking stout for? Mrs. Person, because I fancied some. George, at this time of the day? Mrs. Person, yes. What's wrong with it at this time of the day? George, bewildered. Nothing, I suppose, Annie, but I have never seen you do it before. Mrs. Person, well, you are seeing me now. George, with heavily distaste. Yes, and I don't like it. It doesn't look right. I'm surprised at you. Mrs. Person, well, that ought to be a nice change for you. George, what do you mean? Mrs. Person, it must be some time since you were surprised at me, George. George, I don't like surprises. I'm all for a steady going. You ought to know that by this time. By the way, I forgot to tell you this morning. I didn't want any tea, special snookers match at night at the club tonight, and a bit of supper going, so no tea. Mrs. Person, that's all right. There isn't any. George, astonished. What do you mean? You mean you didn't get any ready? Mrs. Person, yes, and a good thing too. It's turned out. George, aggrieved. That's all very well up. It's suppose I wanted some. Suppose I wanted some. Mrs. Person, oh goodness, listen to the man, annoyed because I don't get a tea for him that he doesn't even want. Ever cried that at the club? George, tried what at the club? Mrs. Person, going up the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you're annoyed because they haven't already poured it out. Try that on them and see what you get. George, I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Person, they laugh at you even more. They do now. So George again sees the stout and he asked surprised stout, and then Mrs. Person agrees, and then he questions her, what are you drinking stout for? So then Mrs. Person replies, because she fancied some, she wanted to drink some. And then George, at this time of the day, so Mrs. Person replies by saying, yes, what's wrong with this time? And George says, nothing, I suppose. And Annie, but I've never seen you do it before. So Mrs. Person says, you're seeing me now. Well, you're seeing me now drinking the stout. I'm drinking, having the drink. George, with heavily distaste, he doesn't like it and says he shows his disagreement with her drinking at this time of the day by saying, yes, and I don't like it, and it doesn't look right. So he's surprised at her. And then Mrs. Person says, well, that ought to be a nice change for you. So George says, what do you mean? And Mrs. Person, it must be some time since you were surprised at me, George. And George says, I don't like surprises. I'm steady going on. You ought to know that by this time. By the way, I forgot to tell you this morning, I wouldn't want any tea. And he also says he doesn't want any tea. And then he has a special snooker match at night at the club tonight and a bit of supper going on. So he doesn't need a tea. So Mrs. Person says, that's all right, and there's no any tea. So George asked her, astonished, why is there not a tea? And what if he wanted some tea? So Mrs. Person says, goodness, listen to the man, annoyed because I didn't get a tea for him. She also get annoyed, and she says, you are getting annoyed because I didn't get a tea for you. And you ever tried that at the club? And George asks, tried what at the club? And Mrs. Person replies, going to the club and telling them that you don't want a glass of beer, but you're annoyed because they haven't already poured it. Try that on them and see them what you get. George says, you don't know what she's talking about. So Mrs. Person says they laugh at you even more than they do now. So George, laugh at me? They don't laugh at me. Mrs. Person, of course they do. You ought to have found out that by this time. Anybody else would have done. You are the one of the standing jokes. You are one of the standing jokes. Famous, they call you Pompey Ompy person because they think you're so slow and pompous. George, never. Mrs. Person, it's always beaten me that why you should want to spend so much time at the place where they're always laughing at you behind your back and calling you names. Leaving your wife at home night after night instead of going out with her doesn't make you look fool. So George again questions, why would they laugh at me? So They don't laugh at me. So Mrs. Person says, of course they do. And you should have found out by now, and anybody else would have found it out. So you are one of the standing jokes. And George is one of the standing jokes in the in the place where he's planning to go tonight. And they call him Pompey Ompy Person because they think you're so slow and pompous. George says never, and Mrs. Person say that he should hang out with he should take his wife out more, and instead of going to a place where he get mocked and made fun of always. So going out with Mrs. Person doesn't make him look like a fool. Cyril enters the right with a glass of milk in one hand and a thick slice of cake in the other. George almost stays turned to him appealingly. So then Cyril enters at the right, and with a glass of milk in his one hand and thick slice of cake in the other. George almost dazed and turns to him appealingly. Here, Cyril, you have been. Sorry. George, here, Cyril, you have been with me to the club once or twice. Don't they laugh at me and call me Pompey Ompy Person? Do they? Cyril, embarrassed, hesitate angrily. Go on, tell me, do they? Embarrassed. Well, yes, Dad, I'm afraid they do. George slowly looks from one another to another, staggered. George, slowly. Well, I'll be damned. George exits left slowly as if somebody had hit him over the head. Cyril, after watching him go, turns to Mrs. Person. Cyril, now you shouldn't have told him that, Mum. That's not fair. You hurt his feeling. Mine too. Mrs. Person, sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. The truth ought to hurt anybody for long. If your father didn't go to the club often, perhaps I'd stop laughing at him. Cyril, gloomingly, I doubt it. So here again, the scene, Cyril enters, and then Cyril, the father George, questions Cyril whether has he seen anyone making fun of his dad and calling him the weird names like Pompey Ompy Pearson. So Cyril also hesitated and embarrassed. He agrees that they do call his father weird names at the place where he goes. So George actually gets surprised and looks from each other, and then he exclaims slowly, well, I'll be damned. And then George exits slowly as if somebody had hit him over the head. Cyril, watching him go, and turns after watching him go, she turns to Mrs. Pearson. He turns to Mrs. Pearson. So Cyril, now you shouldn't have told him that, Mom. That's not fair. You've hurt his feelings and mine too. Mrs. Pearson, sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. The truth out to hurt. So Cyril says, you shouldn't have hurt his feelings and mine too. So Mrs. Pearson says, sometimes it's good to hurt other feeling because if he didn't go back there, then he will not be made fun of by calling the weird names. So Cyril says he doubted. Mrs. Pearson, severely, possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion is worth having. What do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at Greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. Cyril, sulkily, well, what if I do? I've got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I? Mrs. Pearson, I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where is it getting you? There's a sharp, hurried knocking heard off left. Cyril, might be for me, I'll see. Cyril hurries out left. In a moment, he re enters, closing the door behind him. So, Mrs. Pearson says, possibly you do, but that I doubt is whether Your opinion's worth having. What do you know? Nothing. You spent too much time and good money at greyhound races, dirt tracks, and ice shows. So, Mrs. Person says again to Cyril that he spent too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. Cyril agrees. So what if I do? And says he's got to enjoy himself somehow, Haven't I? Mrs. Person says that she wouldn't mind if he were really enjoying himself, but are you? And where's it getting you? So there's a sharp, hurried knock heard of left. Cyril, might be for me, I'll see. So someone knocks at the left door, and Cyril says it might be for him and he'll see. So he hurries out left. In a moment, he re enters, closing the door behind him. It's that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fitzgerald. You don't want her here, do you? Mrs. Pearson sharply. Certainly I do. Ask her in. And don't call her silly old bag either. She's a very nice woman with lot more sense you'll ever have. So the door was knocked by Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald. So Cyril asked her, "You don't want her here, did you? Do you?" And called her and calls her silly old bag from the next door. So Mrs. Pearson disagrees. Sorry, Mrs. Pearson disagrees with him and says, "Certainly I do. That she wants Mrs. Fitzgerald inside the house, and don't call her silly old bag either. And she says she's a very nice woman with lot more sense that you will ever have." Cyril exits left. Mrs. Person finished her shout, smacking her lips. Cyril re-enters left, ushering in Mrs. Fitzgerald, who hesitates in the doorway. Come in, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, moving left anxiously. "I just wondered if everything's all right." "No, it isn't." "Of course it isn't. You be quiet." Cyril, "Why should I be quiet?" Mrs. Pearson, "Because I tell you to, you silly, you spoiled young pecan." Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Oh, no, surely." Mrs. Pearson, "Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, just let me manage my family in my own way, please." "Yes, but Cyril." Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mr. Cyril Pearson, "To you, please." Mrs. Fitzgerald. So in the previous scene, Mrs. Fitzgerald has entered, and then they're actually talking, and she wondered actually everything is going on well. So Cyril says no, and then Mrs. Pearson says that it is going well, and then you be quiet. And Cyril says, "Oh, why should he be quiet?" And then Mrs. Pearson says, "Because I tell you to." And then don't make any fuss, spoiled, silly, spoiled boy. And Mrs. Fitzgerald protestingly tells that, "Oh, surely." And Mrs. Pearson, "Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, just let me manage my family in my own way, please." But Cyril, yes, but Cyril, Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you, please. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald moved to the seat and whispering, "Oh dear, what's happening, Mrs. Pearson?" "Nothing much, just putting them in their pieces, that's all. Doing what you have to done since long." Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Is George home?" She sits beside Mrs. Pearson on the settee. Mrs. Pearson, "Yes, I've been telling him what they think of him at the club." "Well, they think a lot of him, don't they?" "No, they don't, and he knows it." Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Oh dear, I wish you hadn't." Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Pearson, "Nonsense, doing 'em all a word of good, and they'll be eating out your hand soon, you'll see." "I don't think I want them eating out my hand." "Well, whatever you want, they'll be doing it. All three of them, mark my words, Mrs. Pearson." And they're also having a short conversation. And after that, George enters grumpily, and he's unpleasant, surprised when he sees a visitor. He moves to the armchair left and sits down heavily, glumplingly lights his pipe, and he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Farrell, who's regarded him anxiously. Just looked in for a minute. I suppose Mrs. Fitzgerald? Mrs. Fitzgerald, who doesn't know what she's saying. Well, yes, I suppose so. George. Aghast. George. Oh, I'm sorry. Mrs. Fitzgerald. What does it matter? Your name is George, isn't it? Why do you think you are Duke of Edinburgh? George, angrily. What's he got to do with it? Just tell me, and it isn't good enough without her calling me George. No tea. Pompey person, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs, and yes, crying her eyes out. So he says that what's he got to do with it, and what's Duke of Edinburgh has got to do with it, because Mrs. Pearson said that that his name is George, and why do you think you are? Who do you think you are, Duke of Edinburgh? So George again asks, what's he got to do with it, and just tell me. And it isn't bad enough without calling her me a George, and no teaser, a Pompey person, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs. Yes, crying her eyes out. Oh dear, I ought to have known. George, staring at her annoyed. You ought to have known? Why you ought to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at 6s and 7s here. Now, perhaps you'll excuse us. Mrs. Pearson, before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply, I won't excuse you. George Pearson, next time a friend and neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her. Good evening, or how do you do, or something. Don't just march and sit down without a word. It's bad manners. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson, no, it isn't all right. We'll have some decent manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. Glaring at George. Well, what? George asks. George replies. Mrs. Pearson, why don't you get off your club special night tonight? Isn't it? They'll be waiting for you, waiting to have a good laugh. Go on then. Don't disappoint them. George, that's right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Go on. Don't mind me. 6s and 7s. Poor Doris crying her eyes out, getting all the neighbors in to see the fun. Suddenly losing his temper, glaring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, all right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you got any barmy or what? Mrs. Pearson jumping up. If you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I'll slap your big fat silly face. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Oh no. Please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. George staring at her. Either I'm off my chump or you two are. How do you mean? Oh no, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald. Why are you telling yourself to stop when you're not doing? So again, now they're having a conversation, and George actually talks in a rude way to Mrs. Fitzgerald, and then Mrs. Pearson says he should treat his guest with more respect, and sit them and ask them how are you and good evening, and should have some manners. But Mrs. Fitzgerald said it's all right, but then Mrs. Pearson again says no, it's not all right, and he should have some manners. So again George says whatever happened that he will go to no, before that Mrs. Pearson says Mrs. Pearson said go to the special club tonight, and they're only waiting over there to make fun of you, etc. And then George get angry, and he says that yeah, I'm going there only, that will be better, etc. and all those things. And he says make me look silly in front of her also. Her meaning the neighbor. Go on, don't mind me, 6s and 7s. And he says Doris have been crying her eyes out and getting the neighbors in to see the fun. And all right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you got any barmy or something? Mrs. Pearson. If you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I'll slap your big fat silly face. So Mrs. Fitzgerald. Oh no, Mrs. Fitzgerald. She says no, Mrs. Fitzgerald. So George get confused, and George asks why is she telling herself no, Fitzgerald, when she itself is Mrs. Fitzgerald. anything, tell her to stop. Then there would be some sense in it. Staring at Mrs. Pearson. I think you must be tidy. Mrs. Pearson starting up. Say that again, George Pearson. All right. Doris enters the left slowly, looking miserable. She is still wearing the wrap. Mrs. Pearson sits on the settee. Hello, Doris, dear. Doris miserably. Hello, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I thought you were going out with Charlie's friends tonight. Doris, what's that to do with you? Mrs. Pearson, stop that. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson, it isn't all right. I wouldn't have a daughter of mine talking to anybody like that. And answer Mrs. Fitzgerald properly, Doris, or go upstairs again. Doris looks wonderingly at her father. George, don't look at me. I gave it up. I just gave it up. Mrs. Pearson, well, answer her. I was going out with Charlie's friends tonight, but now I've called it off. Oh, what a pity, dear. Why have you? Doris, with a flash of temper, because if you must know, my mother's been going on at me making me feel miserable and saying he's got buck teeth and is half-witted. Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh, you shouldn't have said that. Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'll manage my family. You manage yours. George, taking her off now. Are you, Annie? Mrs. Pearson, they are waiting for you at the club, George. Don't forget, and don't you start crying again, Doris. Mrs. Fitzgerald, that's enough, quite enough. So here again, Mrs. Pearson says that not Mrs. Pearson says say that again, and George Pearson, and then George finally gave up, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald greets Doris when Doris enters slowly, and Doris miserably says hello, Miss Gerald, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald questions her and says that she. Now listen, you two. I want to have a private little talk with Mrs. Fitz. She corrects herself hastily with Mrs. Pearson. So I'll be obliged if you leave us alone for a few minutes. I'll let you know when we're finished. Go on, please. I promise that you won't regret it. There's something here that only I can deal with. George, rising. I am glad somebody can, 'cause I can't. Come on, Doris. George and Doris exit left. As they go, Mrs. Fitzgerald moves to left of the small table and sits. She eagerly beckons Mrs. Pearson to do the same thing. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, we must change back now. We really must. Mrs. Pearson, rising. Why? Mrs. Fitzgerald, because this has gone far enough. I can see they're all miserable, and I can't bear it. Mrs. Pearson, a bit more of the same would do them good, making a great difference already. She moves to the right of the table and sits. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, I can't stand any more of it. I really can't. We must change back. Hurry up, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Pearson, well, if you insist. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, I do. Please. She stretches her hands across the table eagerly. Mrs. Pearson takes them. Mrs. Pearson, quiet now, relax. So, in this conversation, they are planning to change back to their formal body, their original bodies. Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald stare at each other, muttering, exactly as before. They carry out the same action as before, going, lax, and then coming to life. But this time, of course, they become their proper personalities. So, finally, they chanted the prayer. They chanted the special prayer which they had already muttered earlier, and finally they changed back to their original personalities. Mrs. Fitzgerald, ah, well, I enjoyed that. Mrs. Person, I didn't. Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, you ought to have done. Now listen. Mrs. Pearson, don't go soft on them again, else it'll all have been wasted. Mrs. Pearson, I'll try not to, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, they've not had so long as I'd like to have given them. Another hour or two rough treatment might have made it certain. Mrs. Pearson, I'm sure they'll do better now, although I don't know how I'm going to explain. Mrs. Fitzgerald, severely, don't you start any explaining or apologizing, or you're done for. Mrs. Pearson, with spirit, it's all right for you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. After all, they aren't your husband and children. Mrs. Fitzgerald, impressively, now you listen to me. You admitted yourself you were spoiling them, and then they didn't appreciate you. Any apology, any explanation, and you will be straight back where you were. I'm warning you, dear. Just give him a look, a tone of voice. Now, again, to suggest you might be tough with them if you wanted to be. And it ought to work. Anyhow, we can test it. Mrs. Pearson, how? Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, what is it you'd like them to do that they don't do? Stop at home for once? Mrs. Pearson, yes, and give me a hand with supper. Mrs. Fitzgerald, anything you'd like them to do that you enjoy whether they do or not? Mrs. Pearson, hesitating. Well, yes, I like a nice game of rummy, but of course I hardly ever have one, except at Christmas. Mrs. Fitzgerald, getting up. That will do then. She moves towards the door, left, then turns. But remember, keep firm or you've had it. She opens the door, calling, Holly, you can come in now, calmingly away from the door and moving right slightly quietly. But remember, a firm hand. George, Doris, and Cyril file in through the doorway, looking apprehensively at Mrs. Pearson. I'm just off to let you enjoy yourself. The family look anxious at Mrs. Pearson, who smiles. Much relieved, they smile back at her. Doris, anxiously, yes, mother? Mrs. Pearson, smiling, seeing that you don't want to go out, I'll tell you what I thought we'd do. Mrs. Fitzgerald, giving a final warning, remember. Mrs. Pearson, nodding, then looking sharply at the family. No objections, I hope? George, humbly, no, mother, whatever you say. Mrs. Pearson, smilingly, I thought we'd have a nice family game of rummy, and then you children could get the supper ready while I have a talk with your father. George, firmly, suits me. He looked challengingly at the children. What about you two? What about you two? Cyril, hastily, yes, that's all right. Doris, hesitatingly, well, Mrs. Pearson, sharply, what? Speak up. Doris, hastily, oh, I think it would be lovely. Miss Pearson, smilingly, goodbye, Mrs. Fitzgerald, come again soon. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, dear, night all. Have a nice time. Mrs. Fitzgerald exits the left and family cluster around mother as the curtain falls. So finally, the lesson has come to an end. In this, Mrs. Pearson do as Mrs. Fitzgerald told in order to gain importance in her family, and she tells them she want to have a nice family game of rummy, and then she tells the children to get the supper ready while she can have talk with her husband. So she makes them agree, George, Cyril, and Doris, all three of them, without hesitating or asking her back, they agree to do so whatever they are told. So finally Mrs. Fitzgerald exits and the lesson has come to an end. Thank you.